I'm Dean Newlund, and welcome to the Business of Intuition, where I coach, facilitate, train, and speak on the hard science and meaningful experience of intuitive leadership in business, so you can make better decisions, forge real connections, and creatively solve problems to amplify your impact and simplify your life. Welcome to the Business of Intuition. Well, Ginine, it is really a delight to have you on the show. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation because, as I was saying before we hit the record button, that I think so many people in organizations have been trying to figure out the big mystery of how do we make training and development more impactful and how do we measure the results. And so many times people go to an event or training and go, hey, that was great. I got sort of motivated. But then you ask them what they learned, 2 or 3 weeks later, they might remember, the coffee or the donut they ate, but they forget the content. And we were doing just to tee this up, we were doing some research for some company about this whole idea about losing your cognitive memory after a training. It's kind of like you buy a car, right? And as soon as you drive the car off the lot, the value of the car goes down immediately. And it's the same way, I think, when you lose your memory of what you did when you walk out of the training room. And someplace we saw that you lose like 50 to 80% of the information that you gain in a training within 24 hours, and then up to 90% within the first month. So this is a serious issue here. We're spending thousands of dollars and yet people are not retaining that. So start us off. How can we create training that sticks?
Yeah, awesome question. So everything that you just said is the entire reason that I have shifted into this mindset that we have to reimagine the training experience to move from the event mindset that you are speaking of. When we think of training as an event, then it is a terrible investment when I'm losing 90% of what I invested in, right? But if I shift that mindset to understanding that is more of a learning journey, and what are the mile markers along the journey of incremental progress, I can think and plan for and strategize and execute in a very different way. And so that was really how I began my journey into training and development. I started as someone who, way back, I was originally a print manufacturer and packaging structural designer, packaging engineer. And I went through my own first training program and did exactly what you said. I went back. They asked me, hey, Ginine, how did it go? And I was like, my onboarding. I was like, I'm not so sure. What did I remember? Right. And had that own experience. And it led me into this interest of how do we really learn? What does this matter? Or how does this work? And so over time, as my career has evolved and I've gotten into the space of training and development, I was feeling the same thing you were feeling, this isn't working. So a couple pieces came into play. One is I realized we have to have a strategy for why we're even sending people training in the first place. Instead of this check the box, we need to get it done, which is a bunch of what happens in training. We don't have strategic plan for what they're going to go to. We don't even have strategic conversations before we send our people off to training about what we want them to come back with, what our expectations are, what's 1 or 2 things we'd like them to focus on and retain. And that lack of even initial conversation limits the brain's memory, where if I prime them with conversation about what we would like to focus on, what they would like to focus on, they're going to adhere more and remember and retain some of that section of content more. So that's just the first kind of tip and trick.
That's great.
The second side of that, to the end of it, of my whole training reimagined, is that once I leave this event, we've got to sustain it somehow. And there is this fall down in the sense that we don't talk about it, bring it forward, celebrate it, encourage it, or change processes or structures within our organizations. And so when we don't have a space to try new, we fall back on what we know. And that's why it doesn't stick.
So I think the reason why, you tell me what your thoughts are on this, is that we want a Band-Aid approach. We know that we have some training issues with this team, or this part of the organization has got a poor culture, or we don't have good communication here. So let's throw them into a training. Gosh darn it, I hope it works out, but at least we can check the box. And if we are really honest with ourselves, we realize that there's going to be a lot more work possibly to be able to make systemic cultural changes, process changes as a result of what got started. Is that what your sense is too? Is that we kind of want the easy way out. We realize that there's much more to than making these changes than just putting a person through a day-long event.
Yeah. I mean, because the easy answer would be like one size fits all, go do it. 8 hours later, you come back a changed person. But I always joke and say, if that was how it really worked, I wouldn't need a nutritionist, a trainer,
right.
We would no longer have diabetes or addictions. Like we would all just know better. So we would do better. And humans don't work that way. We work in incremental progress. And,
Agreed.
And that's why, right? So that's why I really believe in shifting the metrics of thinking about how we look at training and development is something I refer to as the ROTI, the return on talent investment. And how do we step back and say, how can we look at training through a different lens and different outcomes? What is not just the quantifiable or numeric outcome that we're looking for? Is there something around that? Sure. But what additional process improvements or policy things can come into play? What courageous conversations do we have? What questions are people asking? And how does that all fit the larger picture? So the summary of that really is thinking about metrics that fit into the who, what, how, and why of business. And when I can pull in some different metrics to measure it, I could recognize that maybe me as Ginine had an improvement in my communication skills as a result of that, because instead of delaying having a difficult conversation, I take action on it sooner than I would have. And maybe you, for example, come back with a new idea as it relates to how to improve a process. And you bring something back to the table around that. And now our training is moving individually in individual ways, but towards overall success in the organization in incremental but sustained ways. And so I think we're just measuring it wrong.
I agree. I remember once we were doing some work with Honeywell many, many years ago. So I don't know what things are like now, but I remember they said each employee has 40 hours of training that they have to get a year. It doesn't matter what it's in. They just got to check the box. And we were one of those boxes to check. And although we got paid, I don't think it was very valuable in the end because it was not seen as an ongoing change process. It was seen as more like we were providing them that we're done. And I remember also a quote from, I don't know who it was, maybe Sam Walton, who said that people behave in the area in which they are measured. So is the key thing here that we can create a better, more appropriate mindset about learning and development by convincing the sponsors, meaning the ELT, the director, whatever the case may be, who's bringing in this training, that we need to be able to have a more systemic, longer term process, an iterative process. And by virtue of that, we can actually measure results and we can show return on investment. Like you said, return on talent investment. We can show that. Does that then help them take action because they can see benefit? Whereas if we don't see benefit, then why should we invest more time in this?
Yeah, absolutely. You're saying it really well. And it's a mindset of thinking about 1% change, the stacking benefit. So I might have just a 1% change on the way I behave this week. But as I get stronger and more confident, for example, in my ability to have difficult conversations, right now, it might take me an hour to prepare to do that mentally, documenting all of those things. That's business, time being used. But I can gain more efficiency when my confidence is there that I've delivered them. I get reinforcement. My leader and I have a conversation about how it went and what lesson I can learn, and I move forward. So it's recognizing that the skills are embedded within the daily work that we are doing, and how can daily work be enhanced? And when I start to measure those 5-minute increments across salary, for example, depending on how large your organization is, we start to really pay for the training that is going forward. So therefore, that's the justification cost of incremental change for investing in a talent development program, for example, right? If I get 5 minutes more productivity out of you this week, or a more efficient way for you to do it over a 40 or 50 week year, how many hours is that? It's almost an entire week back.
So I think that when you get to a skill development,
Mm-hmm.
things to do, there are things that have easy metrics. Let's say you're in some sort of a manufacturing plant, and because you can produce more widgets within an hour than you did before, it's a fairly easy way in which to measure a result. So I get that argument very, very well. And I could see where you could create an ROI relatively easily. However, when it comes to soft skills, when it comes to things like, well, we're just not good at crucial conversations. The trust in the team isn't there because we're not communicating very well. There's a lot of gossip going on. We've got a brand new team who really don't know each other. It's not that there's anything wrong, but we just haven't built any sort of foundation. So how do we then best measure things that are behavioral that don't relate specifically to an action?
Yeah. And so I think that's where some qualitative versus quantitative data comes into place, right? So this idea of, for example, having a confidence conversation around that crucial conversation that you use as an example. Hey, Ginine, on a scale of 1 to 10 going into training, how are you feeling right now when it comes to these types of conversations? Great. I get a benchmark number. Now in 30 days, 60 days, you're having more of these ongoing conversations. Where are you today, Ginine? How comfortable are you feeling? What's easier for you today than it was before? Now we start to talk. What sticky point are you still at? Has that number moved at all? You told me before you started at 5. Are we still at a 5? What's going to take to get to a 6? And it's just a self-rating. So it's not really meant to be a true measure, but it's an ongoing conversation.
So it's more for the conversation versus it being a particular true number, because I could see researchers out there saying, well, wait a minute, there's a certain sort of indication that when you do a second survey based on some experience you had, you normally give yourself a higher score because you yourself want to feel like you've made progress, whether you have or not.
Of course.
And so it's not so much that we're going to use as a hard number, but it's something that will generate discussion and reinforcement.
It's a generation and reinforcement tool, and it's to just use it as a neutral way to begin conversation. What's it going to take? Or that's great, Ginine. You said you went from a 4 to a 6 in your comfort level. Tell me why. What reflective thing have you had, right? The action of keeping it top of mind, practicing, considering, reflecting on how you're doing something reinforces skills, and it creates mindset shift. So it's overlaying coaching skills, for example, and that's essentially where soft skill development comes from. Reflection, coaching, confidence, recognizing what works, what doesn't, and those softer skills.
Yeah, you mentioned an interesting thing about mindset shifts. I've always had this perspective that behavior doesn't really change until the mindset does first.
We are fully in alignment on that statement.
Otherwise, why don't I just go read all my books on financial planning or weight loss or how to build this? If it's that simple, why am I not doing it? It's because my mindset hasn't caught up to it.
The mindset hasn't caught up. And I would even further push the word mindset into emotion. And my emotions and feelings haven't caught up to it. So mindset is a combination of awareness and emotion. That's my definition, probably not a textbook definition. So Ginine, with the way things are now, what are we talking here? March of 2024. We're still sort of on the back end of a bad cold called COVID and all of the interesting ramifications that rippled throughout our society. We still have this ongoing confusion about whether we should bring people back to work. Are we virtual? Are we partial? Are we hybrid? I don't know if organizations have quite all of them figured that out yet. There is truly an interesting pandemic of loneliness and isolation that we are all, not all, but some of us are feeling more than others. There's an added amount of fear. So all this comes into play that puts downward pressure on the ability to learn, meaning that the brain itself takes up 20% of our calories in our entire body. It's not really wanting to change a lot. It can if it's got enough rest and all the other things, but it doesn't probably in all actuality. If you talk to a neuroscientist, say the brain loves to change, right? It does, but it has a certain exhaustion
level, right? Just like the body does. And then you put all the stress that's coming in on us. Do you feel like that training and development and what we are talking about in this conversation is becoming more difficult, or just what's your take on this whole process about making training stick when we have maybe a headwind around all this stress?
Yeah. So excellent points and questions. There is a ton of headwind when it comes to this. And one of the biggest components of that headwind is like a sensory overload and our attention span. When I first started in this industry about 20 years ago, we would say that the attention span was somewhere, in an 11 to 12 minute kind of window before you really went off. We all know that is not the attention span anymore. And we're into the minutes, and in some situations into, under a minute of your actual attention before it gets lost to something and having to get pulled back in. So yes, the answer just is yes. And the headwinds of loneliness and a disconnected community is a massive component of all of this and what's involved in all of that. So your question was, how do we get around that? And one of the things I also believe in, besides this ROTI concept, is something I refer to as the power of one. This idea that we need to build connections with people and for people. So together as community, the emotional side of it, and then connections for the learning on the intellectual side of it. And the framework that I use when I'm working with individuals is what I've called the power of one conversation, one idea, and one action to create change. And it's the idea that I will have one conversation with you. We're modeling it right now. We're having a conversation. It may ideally trigger one idea. And if I can work with you to take an action on that, we've begun to kick off the domino of change in a direction. And I just deeply believe that it's the stacking of those things in small moments over time that creates the behavioral change and shift that we're really all looking for. And so I can go to an event. We can do it for an hour, a day, a week, name the amount of time. It's a lot of information. And that's why the teeing up of that conversation matters. Our attention span has shortened, and the real practice of behavioral change will come through in the supportive power of one moments for people after that.
I like what you're saying. That brings up the power of one, right? One conversation, one idea. So here's an idea that you made me think of, or maybe even two, was this idea that I remember a while back, many years ago. Let me back up. I've been thinking a lot about recently that we keep saying that one of the most important skills that we keep hearing about is self-awareness. And I realize that self-awareness probably now is not the most important skill. That before self-awareness is probably focus or being present. Because if you can't stay focused, how do you have the ability to have self-awareness? If I'm scattered all over the place with my thinking, I have TikTok videos going and I got people calling me, how can I be self-aware in a world where I don't have focus, right? Many years ago, I heard about, something called a sensory deprivation tank. If you've ever been in one, they are so cool, right?
They're very cool.
Smiling, right? There's one up the street. I haven't been to it in a long time, but for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it's basically a big egg. It's about this, probably, 10 feet by 5 feet, right? It's filled with salt water at body temperature. And you get in there, and some of you might feel a little claustrophobic, but you can turn a light on or not. And you basically float in this water, and you turn off the lights, and there's no senses. You hear your heartbeat like it's a drum. You can feel and you can hear your blood rushing through your body. You take away all the senses, sight and sound and feeling. And what it does is it forces you almost through your external environment to be in the moment. And of course, your thoughts sometimes go wild, you fall asleep and so forth. And I've heard science or people say that you can actually learn a language by listening to language tapes while in the sensory deprivation tank a lot faster because you have no external distractions. So learning can actually increase exponentially when you take out all the distractions. So here's my question, which is like what I'm leading up to.
Yeah.
When you just say what you just said, that it's so important in that power of one and to be able to create learning that sticks. How have you been able to, in a training or in an event, a facilitation, to get people present, to get people in the moment, to get people focused so that they're not distracted and they can learn and can connect with each other? Do you have any tried and true tips and tools of the trade that you feel like you can share?
Yeah. So one very simple one is within the first 30 seconds of starting, before you begin, you ask everybody to dump their thoughts. 30 seconds of dumping their thoughts onto a piece of paper. It's critical to kind of try to do it on paper versus typing. There is a reason when you hand scribe things, there's some research behind writing and what that does with the brain. But basically, you get them to scribble it out, all the things that you came in with that are on your mind that you want to make sure that you do not forget. Because the brain loops in the sense that it will keep bringing forward the thoughts until it feels like it's completed. So if you think of it from the perspective of the to-do list, when you leave at the end of day, when you leave the work at the end of the day, you do not go home thinking about all of the great things you accomplished. You think about the 4 things you don't want to forget about tomorrow, right?
Right.
So when I do something this tiny, where I just have them dump everything out for 30 seconds of continuous writing, all the things you don't want to forget, that you're worried about everything. And I say, great, you've captured it all. Can you set that aside? And now can you join me in the room? That's number one, whether that's a virtual room or a physical space.
Great idea.
Second one is to make sure that everybody hears their voice and for everybody to hear their name as quickly as possible. When someone hears their own name and brings their voice into the room, they bring their body into the room. And that helps them become more focused and present as well. And then I would say the third tip is more for the facilitator on the training, to just expect and understand that focus is something we lose, and that we remind and give permission that says, hey, I know what moments your mind might wander. I'm not going to take it personally. I just ask you, when you catch it, to bring yourself back into the space with us and refocus, like a mindfulness technique.
So the number 2 one that you just mentioned of 3, how would you go about making sure that the voice is heard and the voice is used? Well, the name is used. I mean, do you go around having people introduce themselves? I mean, something as simple as that?
No, but sometimes it could be that if you want to do those introductions. Sometimes I do a silly thing that just says, all at the same time, we're going to say, shout out and say, good morning, my name is.
Oh, okay.
And
so getting yourself in the room.
Simultaneously do it.
Okay.
And then they laugh and think it's crazy. And then I tell them why we've done it. And then I reinforce the fact that let's do this all together. Yeah. Welcome today, Dean. I'm so happy you're here. And within the first few minutes, I try to acknowledge people's names. I try to get them to speak pretty quickly. You remind me of something I haven't done in a while, but I used to do it, where you were talking about this number 3 idea that, hey, we're all going to lose focus here. The purpose is to try to stay focused. And so what I'd like to ask you to do, I've done this before, is when you lose focus, when you've left the room, please raise up your hand and say, I just left, but I'm back now. And everybody laughs a little bit. And every once in a while he goes, hey, Dean, I just left, but I'm back. And then we laugh and then we get back. But the honesty of that exercise is that it makes people realize that it's normal, and to sort of call out when it happens. Now, of course, it happens a couple of times and then we get on to the work, but it's a way of really just acknowledging what you just said. It's a great idea. Would you mind if I take that into my classroom? I'd love your permission to use it.
Facilitators steal everything from everybody else. I mean, there's only once in a while you get an original idea. It's all kind of amalgamed of other people's ideas. No way to go right ahead. Do you have can you give me any sort of like a case study? Like, last week I worked with this company and this was the training or the facilitation I did. How did you work them through, just briefly, soup to nuts, the process using the model that you just described?
The Power of One framework?
Yeah, but also the return on talent investment that you've been talking about. So one, getting people in the room, but also this sort of iterative approach to making sure that the training sticks, that we turn it into process, the whole thing.
Yeah, I got you.
Not the whole, we could take 2 hours on it, I'm sure, but like some highlights of that.
Yeah. Quick version of that is it really starts in the process of how are we designing and what is the behaviors that we're trying to look at and understand and how does that get you to their business. So that ROI piece of it is a conversation that typically happens at a more strategic business planning level. What are the benchmarks we want to measure? Do we have any to begin with? And if not, then what do we want to identify and start as a baseline? And what is a reasonable approach to kind of like beginning that process? So fairly recently, I've had a small business that I have been working with, 40 people, probably $10 million in revenue, smaller business. And the reason I'm sharing that is because I want small business owners to recognize it doesn't have to be big enterprise that is running all of this. It works in both environments. So conversation was, what is it that we really want to do? And their focus is on improving some processes. They've had a lot of exponential growth. Things are not documented. And how are we going to go forward and improve our managers' interviewing skills? That's what we've been focusing on. And so we built some metrics around that. We did a training about what is it that we are looking like and looking for out of our interviewing process. We collaboratively used examples in a workshop setting to say, what is it that you want to have? What are the values you're hiring for? What are the behaviors that we're looking for? We defined collaboratively that environment of what that was. And now I've been observing the hiring process. And at the end, supporting them, debriefing and having some conversations about what worked, what didn't, and what we're going to enhance on the process. So it's kind of a soup to nuts full example, with the goal to reduce their turnover, which is a metric, financial metric, a cultural metric. There's a lot of components that are with that. And so I can't wrap it up with a bow and tell you, yep, we're good.
No, I know. You're still working it.
Process. Yeah. But yeah, that's an example of something I'm working on right now in the last 7 weeks.
We are working with a pharmaceutical lab company that we were trying to find out what is the main thing that is the metric that we could measure. And it really came down to retention. It really came down to having people stay at the company longer because of the reasons why we all know how important that is. And, filling a position is very costly, very expensive, costs, half a year's worth of salary as a minimum to be able to do that, So keeping people. And so I think it's a really good point that you make is sort of building with the end in mind, working way backwards. What's the purpose of this? And let's figure out a way to get there.
Yep, exactly. And I just think that sometimes training isn't viewed that way. I have a lot of theories on why that is that I could evangelize on in a different moment. But we're not necessarily putting human behavior and human dynamics at the center of it. We want to send people into a moment, a training experience, and think that they should come out different people and behave entirely differently. And it just isn't human behavior. So we're fighting the stream, pushing against it with misaligned expectations about what is even possible.
Yeah.
And then being disappointed in our results when in a different context, just for talking about pharmaceutical manufacturing, right? In a different context, a 1% improvement is celebrated. Yeah. A 1% reduction in error is monumentally celebrated. But when it's humans, we don't always see that as a value add. And we're no, we're the rule that keeps on giving, because the unintended ripple effect of my 1% actually contributes to your 1%. So when I show up 1% better, engaging with you, you have the opportunity to show up 1% better working with me on our human dynamics, our personal communications, right? So if I don't rub you the wrong way today because I was a little more self-aware and I didn't tease you about something that happened yesterday and it didn't get under your skin, I've already advanced both of us, not just me, but we don't see it that way.
You just made me realize something that I've been thinking about more and more lately, and you just sort of helped crystallize it for me, was that the role of a trainer in an organization or a facilitator in an organization, if they were to really take on what you're saying, they have to look more globally. They have to look more systemically. They have to look more top down. And ergo, they take on more of an organizational development role, because what they're doing is not an isolated, siloed event. AKA event, like we talked about before, it
Yeah.
needs to be in the context of something much larger for it to really make a difference. And so I think we sort of pigeonhole our trainers and developers and our facilitators into these little isolated, doers of events versus an organizational wide consultant almost.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really why I got into the work that I'm doing in the way that I'm doing. The pigeonholing of being an instructional designer, a training facilitator, all of those roles that I was in, e-learning developer early on in my career just kept me feeling like I'm putting the Band-Aid, to use your words from earlier, on this moment. And in that, it's a disservice to everybody. It's a disservice to the profession and the expertise that L&D brings. It's a disservice to the individual who's sitting in that room, who's hungry for more, and who just is looking for guidance on how to unleash their superpowers and be a hero in their own story. And you're prohibiting the possibility of business to do even more massive and incredible things with the work and the purpose that they're serving, because we keep playing small. And
Yes.
the most important component, from my view, in a business is the power of its people and what is possible for them. And I even say right now, like in the AI generation where people are getting nervous about AI coming in, I joke and say, it still all started with a conversation, an idea, and an action. Go back to that original AI thought that we could do this thing called artificial intelligence. Could you even imagine that?
Yeah.
And those are conversations, ideas, and actions that inspired into something new. And I just firmly believe that humans will have a place in that. It's just going to be, what new innovation are we intuitively coming up with that advances the world? And how do we navigate between those spaces and hold on to the humanness and the connection that is uniquely the human experience?
That's right.
I know it's a little evangelistic.
I love it.
I'm passionate about it because I love it.
I do too. You remind me of a quote. I don't remember the name of the author, but I think she wrote Fierce Conversations. And I'm going to summarize it based on what you said. What made me think about was that the relationships, marriages, friendships, departments, companies, nations grow and die all one conversation at a time. And it goes back to this idea around the power of one. That first conversation, either it makes it better or makes it worse, probably doesn't stay the same. And it's that ripple effect that you talked about before, is how important those one points of contact are.
Yes. And I love that you said that it can go one direction or the other.
Yeah.
What's happening is that we're not doing it intentionally either.
No.
We haphazardly stumble into all of them.
Yes.
That's the hyperbole, but we're stumbling into them.
Yes.
And this idea that it's just, I trip into them. And some of them, like our conversation today, is feeling pretty awesome. And I have to say, I'm excited that it was more than one idea you said. I have two.
Absolutely.
So
probably 15.
Yeah. That was a much better ROI than I anticipated.
That's great.
Right? But that idea of like, okay, this is fostering something. This is promoting something. It's even the beauty of podcasting. We're bringing out this opportunity to have conversation between you and me, but it's probably triggering and tipping off conversations elsewhere on this planet. That ripple effect is massive. And when we pull back a little bit and see the broader picture of L&D, for example, like you said, we can see that there is a greater impact here than the momentary impact. And if we measure change over a longer window of time and do the steps necessary to sustain it and support it individually, in a targeted and intentional way, the ROI comes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's for the trainers and the developers and the facilitators and everybody out there, I would like to just simply reiterate something you just said, is that ripple effect. What is often the case is that we don't know what that ripple effect is, because once it leaves us, it's gone. I had somebody just recently, I finished up a coaching relationship with this wonderful woman, and she says, well, I want to share with you something. I said, what's that? It says, I've got a whole list of what she called Dean-isms. And so she sent me this whole list. I went, I had no idea any of this stuff sticks. I don't know after the conversation. It's a done deal. I'm no longer know, right? It's on its way. The children have fled the house. The bird has fled the coop. I don't know. But so it's like, and I was like, sort of like touched by that, right? But I'm saying that we have no idea just the impact we have on other people, and the ripple effect that you say is so true. And just trust that it's there, not even though you don't know what it is. Trust that it makes a difference.
Yeah. Can I share a quick story with you about how this all came for me?
Yes.
So I know that this idea of like life-defining moments, I've got many, but one of them that is really professionally profound. I was doing this training kind of stuff, right? And I was brought into a large telecommunications company many years ago, early in my career, 3-4 years. I developed a new sales model for them. We were rolling out that sales model. I was helping move the middle, as they say, the middle, low to middle performers, trying to kind of coach them along. And, you parachute in and then you parachute out. So like the nature of what I do as a consultant. Right. So 6 months later, I'm back there and this woman comes running up. And she's like, Ginine, I've got to tell you something. I was like, okay. She said, my daughter, she's in music classes. And I did that like memory thing we do. Like, am I supposed to recall this? And she says to me, oh, I'm so sorry. What I mean is my numbers have improved and I am making my bonus every month. And so my daughter, I was able to enroll her in music classes. And that was the moment that it really locked for me. That training is not just one thing. It is this ripple effect. What is the effect that this young girl on her life with music? Yes. I don't know where that will end and where that will end. And so sometimes it just can get into the grind as trainer, like, oh, one more class, one more thing. Yeah. But that always stuck with me because it was that moment that I realized the true power of personal development and the idea that helping people do their jobs better helps people develop their own personal superpower. And like I mentioned before, then they get to become the hero of their own story. She was the hero in her story. I just helped her unlock her own superpowers through some conversation and ideas.
That's such a great idea. And again, I'm going to have to give you another example of what you just said. We had this, my wife and I have this 24-year-old son. He lives away. He's not far away. He's about a mile away, but he sent us this absolutely delightful text this morning about, how much he's learned from us. And of course, there's been some tough times in his life, but he's so grateful. And he's realizes that he's really quite fortunate to be in the family. And we both went, oh my God, that's so sweet. And my wife says, I think I'm going to cry. And he goes, I know. And so it was just like, you don't know that ripple effect sometimes until, and maybe it does come back to you. I think it does come back to you, but maybe not as a real one-off. Like this was the result of that. It's just sort of the overall quality of your life, right? In the experience you have. Here's the thing.
Some seeds that get planted die. That's part of the learning kernels. Yeah. Some take a long time to grow and find their way out there into the world. Some sprout immediately and they're off and running. It's just this idea that I have to understand that. My mom is a very powerful influence on my life, and she used to give these one-line quotes, and there are a few that really have defined the direction of my life. But the one that you're talking about right now, she used to say, Ginine, it's not always about moving someone from A to Z. Sometimes A to B is good. Right. And then A to C, and then B to C, and then C to D. Not everybody's going to zoom through it. Sometimes it takes time. And that helped me along the way in training and development. And then she always used to say, and the power of one framework came from my mother in the sense that she used to say this to me as a kid. She would always say, hey, Ginine, never underestimate the power of one. It's the only number that changed the world. And as a little kid, I would go, okay. And then as a young adult, I was like, Mom, power of one, exponential number of one, not very powerful. And she said, someday you'll understand. And then I realized, no, she means the domino effect of one. That idea, the one thing that, right? Yes. And so now I attribute this kind of initial idea of understanding conversation, idea, action. It actually goes for me back to a childhood comment. And over time, that's evolved in my career, realizing like I've had very powerful power of one moments with mentors, with experiences, with losses, with struggles. And how do you take those and use them to move your life in a direction and to, whether that's individually or in a career or a business, it's a loose framework, but I always sometimes think that the most broad ideas are the most applicable because you can apply them in so many contexts.
Well said, whether it be with your mother, my son, my wife, your friend, the person you meet over picking up groceries with you, or you're in the facilitation of a group of 20 executives. It all kind of comes back to that sort of, wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed this. I just did, as always, I never know what to expect with these conversations. They're just sort of a delight to sort of find out what's going to happen. It's like I open up a box and the box is this podcast conversation. It's like, wow, this is an interesting gift that I just got. I tell people all the time, he goes, do you get a lot of business from your podcast? And he goes, I think we get some name recognition and people talk about it. People comment about it. But I have to say, I get, I don't know, probably at least, I don't know. See, that's that ripple effect thing. I don't know what real benefits people get because I don't always know. I just know I get a lot of benefit. And you today have been that for me.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been amazing talking to you because it's just this conversation flow. Your style is natural. I genuinely mean that I listen to your podcast. I really do. I find it interesting. I find it interesting. I enjoy the people that I, have heard in conversations and kernels of information from them. And so I was like, when the opportunity came to speak with you, I was like, yes, please.
Oh, well, that's great. See, again, yes, ripple effect. I never knew, right? Now I know. Yeah. That's awesome.
So now you know. So all right, so let's
awesome. Tie this off by saying, how can people connect with you and follow your work?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I have a website, GinineCapozzi.com. My name is spelled uniquely, GineCapozzi. I am sure that you will provide that to your listeners and your
Absolutely.
Notes.
Yes.
And so they are free to reach out to the website if they want to have a one-on-one conversation with me. I offer a free kind of kickoff call to explore any topic. My services fall into 3 categories. I do individual coaching. I do strategic learning and development, OD work for organizations, and I help them professionalize or deliver training as well. So it falls into 3 buckets depending on what they're looking for. And of course, LinkedIn is the way to go these days. They can also find me on LinkedIn and through podcasts like yours.
Ginine, it's been really a delight. I hope we stay in touch.
Absolutely. Me as well.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Business of Intuition. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com.